The year was 1875, and the Arizona Territory was less a place on a map than it was a state of mind, a fever dream of red dust, heat that could crack a man's resolve, and a silence so vast it swallowed the sound of prayers before they could reach heaven. The sun hung low and angry in the western sky, bleeding crimson over the mesas. Below it, the iron horse crawled across the desert floor, a black mechanical scar cutting through the ancient sagebrush and alkali flats. The train did not glide. It shuddered and heaved, coughing thick plumes of coal smoke that settled like a gray shroud over the trailing cars. Inside the third-class carriage, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, wet wool, and the copper tang of anxiety. The passengers were the refuse of the East and the desperate hope of the West prospectors with nothing but a pickaxe and a cough. Soldiers discharged without honor, and families huddled over meager bundles, their eyes vacant with the realization that the frontier promised hardship more often than it promised gold. In the far corner of the carriage, near the rear door where the draft was strongest, a man sat alone. He was separated from the rest not by a wall, but by an invisible circle of unease that the other passengers gave him a wide berth to maintain. Cale did not look like the miners or the farmers. He wore the clothes of a man who lived between worlds. His trousers were canvas, worn white at the knees, but over his broad shoulders hung a heavy coat made of animal pelt wolf, perhaps, or mountain lion dyed a deep charcoal that seemed to absorb the dim light of the lantern swaying overhead. Cale sat with the stillness of a predator waiting for the wind to change. His skin was the color of burnished copper, and his hair, black as a raven's wing, was pulled back severely, though a few strands escaped to frame a face composed of sharp angles and high cheekbones. He was of the Eagle River people, a scout who had sold his skills to the army to keep his own kin from starving, only to find that betrayal was the only currency the government truly honored. Now, he rode the rails as a ghost, belonging to no one, despising the blue coats and the outlaws with equal measure. His dark eyes moved slowly across the carriage. He catalogued threats, not faces. The drunkard 3 rows up had a knife in his boot, but he was too intoxicated to use it. The preacher reading a Bible was harmless. The mother nursing a child was terrified. Cale's hand rested casually near his hip, beneath the folds of that heavy coat, where a Colt Navy revolver sat in a well-oiled holster. He did not sleep. He rarely slept when surrounded by the white man. The train's whistle shrieked, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls, signaling the approach to Black Creek Station. The brakes squealed, metal grinding against metal, throwing the standing passengers off balance as the beast lurched to a halt. Dust swirled outside the grime-streaked windows. Black Creek was not a town. It was a collection of shacks held together by spit and hope, clustered around a water tower. The door at the front of the carriage opened, letting in a blast of dry, gritty heat. A girl stepped inside. She could not have been more than 18 years old, in a carriage defined by roughness and dirt. She stood out like a wildflower growing in a slaughterhouse. She wore a dress of faded calico that had seen better days, the hem heavy with the red dust of the road. Over it, she wore a thin, gray cloak that was entirely unsuited for the coming chill of the desert night. A bonnet shadowed her face, but it could not hide the pallor of her skin or the rims of her eyes, which were red and swollen, as if she had wept until there were no tears left. Lila Monroe paused at the threshold, her chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. Her knuckles were white as she gripped a battered canvas bag against her stomach. She held it not as one holds luggage, but as a mother holds a newborn protective, desperate, shielding it from the world. To the casual observer, she looked like a schoolteacher fleeing a bad posting, or perhaps a dutiful niece traveling to care for a sick aunt. But Cale, watching from his corner, saw something else. He saw the way her gaze darted frantically from face to face, checking the exits, checking the windows. He saw the tremor in her hands. He saw a creature that had been hunted, the conductor, a portly man with a mustache stained by tobacco juice, pushed past her to shout at someone on the platform, jostling her shoulder. Lila flinched violently, shrinking against the wood paneling, her eyes wide with terror. She had reason to be afraid. Only 10 minutes ago, while purchasing her ticket while shaking hands, she saw it, nailed to the wall of the station master's office. Fresh paste still darkening the corners, was a sheet of paper. The sketch was crude, but the likeness was undeniable. The curve of the jaw, the large, expressive eyes. But it was the words beneath the image that had made her blood run cold. Reward $500, return of property, Mrs. Lila Maddox, runaway. Mental instability, approach with caution. It did not say, wanted for crime. It said, property. Lila had stared at the paper, feeling the phantom weight of Colonel Jasper Maddox's heavy gold ring against her cheek, hearing his gravelly voice whispering that he owned her, body and soul, bought and paid for with her father's debts. She was not a person to him. She was a broodmare, a decoration for his dinner parties, and now, a thief. She squeezed the canvas bag tighter. Inside, wrapped in her only spare petticoat, was the ledger, the black book she had pulled from his safe while he was in a drunken stupor. She didn't understand all the numbers, but she understood the names. Names of judges, names of sheriffs, and names of men who had died in accidents shortly before their land was signed over to the Maddox Cattle Company. She moved down the aisle, the floorboards groaning under her boots. The carriage was full, but there were spaces, a bench near the drunkard, a space next to a large woman with a basket of chickens. Then, the door opened again. The air in the carriage seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 men stepped aboard. They did not look like passengers. They moved with the swagger of men who were accustomed to people stepping out of their way. They wore long leather dusters coated in road grit. Their hats were pulled low, and their spurs chimed with a dull, ominous percussion against the floor. The man in the lead was tall, with a face like a hatchet and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He stopped at the front of the car, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, near the heavy iron of his Remington. He did not sit. He stood, slowly chewing a toothpick, and began to scan the faces of the passengers, row by row. It was the look of a wolf inspecting a herd of sheep, seeking the weak one, seeking the specific scent of prey. Lila froze. She was halfway down the aisle. If she turned back, she would draw attention. If she ran, she would be caught. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to sit. She needed to disappear. She looked to her left. A man with grease in his hair leered at her, patting the empty spot beside him. His smile was missing teeth, and his eyes roamed over her bodice with a hunger that made her stomach turn. She looked to her right. A merchant was counting coins, indifferent to her existence, but he sat directly under the lamp, fully illuminated. Then she looked to the corner. The man in the fur coat sat in the shadows. He was terrifying in his own way. The savage nature of his coat, the copper skin, the deadly stillness, he was everything the warnings in her father's church had told her to fear. He was the heathen, the savage, the unknown. But when Cale's eyes met hers, Lila stopped. He did not look at her with the predatory lust of the man with the greasy hair. He did not look at her with the possessive arrogance of Colonel Maddox. He did not even look at her with the curiosity of the other passengers. His gaze was flat, abyssal. It was the look of a mountain witnessing a storm unmoved, uninterested, and utterly detached. In his eyes, she was not a woman, and she was not a prize. She was simply a disturbance in the air. For the first time in months, Lila felt a strange, paradoxical safety. To be ignored was a mercy. To be seen as nothing was better than to be seen as property. She made her choice. Lila moved quickly to the back of the car. She lowered herself onto the wooden bench opposite Cale, pressing herself as close to the window and as far from him as the narrow seat allowed. She pulled her cloak tight, pulling the brim of her bonnet down to shield her face from the aisle. Cale did not move. He did not blink. He simply shifted his gaze away from her, back to the front of the car, where the 3 gunmen were slowly working their way down the aisle. The conductor blew his whistle, and the train lurched forward with a violent jolt. The wheels slipped on the iron rails before finding purchase, and the carriage began to rock. Lila exhaled, a shaky, broken sound. She turned her head toward the window, watching the dusty town of Black Creek slide away, replaced by the endless, darkening scrubland. But in the reflection of the glass, she watched the three men. They were talking to the conductor. The leader with the scar held up a piece of paper, the wanted poster. The conductor squinted at it, shrugged, and gestured vaguely toward the back of the train. Lila's blood turned to ice. They knew she was on the train. She gripped the canvas bag until her fingers ached. The ledger inside felt heavy, like a stone that could drag her to the bottom of the ocean. Maddox was not just a man. He was a spider who had spun a web across the entire territory. He owned the law in Pima County. He owned the water rights in the valley. And now, he had sent his hounds to fetch his runaway bride. She risked a glance at the man across from her. Cale was staring out the window now, or seemed to be, but Lila noticed something. His right hand, previously resting on his thigh, had slid imperceptibly to the side. It was now hidden beneath the heavy fur of his coat, hovering exactly where a holster would be. He knew. The realization hit Lila with the force of a physical blow. This savage scout, this silent warrior, had analyzed the room before she had even taken her seat. He had seen the gunman. He had seen her fear. He had connected the dots, but he said nothing. He did not expose her. He sat in his corner, a statue carved from resentment and solitude, wrapped in the fur of a dead beast. The train picked up speed, the rhythm of the wheels becoming a steady, hypnotic clatter, click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. Outside, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a twilight of bruised purples and deep indigos. The interior of the carriage grew darker, the single oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that made the passengers look like ghouls. The three gunmen began to move. They were taking their time. They stopped at the first row. The leader grabbed a sleeping man by the shoulder, wrenching him awake, peering into his face before shoving him back in disgust. They were checking everyone. Lila felt tears prick her eyes. She bit her lips so hard she tasted iron. There was nowhere to run. The train was a cage moving at 30 miles an hour. She looked at the vast, empty landscape rolling outside. This was the West. The preacher said it was a land of milk and honey, of new beginnings, but Lila saw only dry bones and thorns. It was a land where the strong devoured the weak, and Colonel Maddox was the strongest of them all. She looked at the canvas bag. If they caught her, the ledger would burn. The truth about the murders, the stolen land of the Eagle River people, the bribes paid to the governor, it would all vanish. She would be dragged back to the plantation house, to the heavy velvet curtains and the smell of brandy and the sound of the colonel's boots coming down the hallway. No, she thought, a sudden spark of defiance flaring in her chest. I will not go back. I will die in this desert first. The gunmen were 3 rows away. Lila's breath hitched. She looked at Cale. He was her only proximity, if not her ally. He was the only variable in the equation that Maddox's men might not have calculated. She studied his face in the dim light. There was a scar on his jawline, faint and white. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of lack of sleep, but the weariness of a soul that has seen too much blood. Cale felt her eyes on him. Slowly, he turned his head. For a moment, the noise of the train seemed to fade. The coughing passengers, the crying child, the clatter of the wheels, it all receded, leaving only the space between the 18-year-old girl and the hardened warrior. He saw the terror in her. It was a raw, naked thing, but beneath the terror, he saw the spark, the refusal to submit. It reminded him of a trapped wolf he had once seen, chewing off its own leg to escape a steel trap. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort, but he shifted his legs slightly, his heavy boots taking up more space, subtly creating a barrier between her and the aisle. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible, but to Lila, it was a mountain. The gunmen were 2 rows away. The leader laughed, a harsh barking sound, as he terrified a young boy by lifting his hat with the barrel of his gun. "Looking for a little bird," the gunman announced, his voice booming over the rattle of the train. "Pretty little thing. Stole something that doesn't belong to her. Ran away from a loving husband." The passengers fell silent, heads bowed, praying to be invisible. "Mrs. Maddox," the man shouted, his voice dripping with mock affection. "Come on out, darling."
"The colonel is worried sick."
Lila shrank into herself, wishing she could dissolve into the wood of the seat. She pulled the canvas bag up to her chin. Cale turned back to the window, his expression bored, but the muscles in his neck were tight cords. He did not like these men. He smelled the violence on them. They were the same kind of men who shot buffalo from train windows for sport and left the carcasses to rot in the sun. They were the root of the territory. The train rounded a bend, the wheels screeching. The lantern swung violently, throwing the carriage into momentary darkness before swinging back. In that flicker of shadow, the gunman took a step closer. They were now one row away. Lila knew it was over. They would see her. They would drag her out. She looked at Cale again. This time, she didn't just look, she begged. She poured every ounce of her desperation into her gaze, begging him to see her not as a white woman, not as an enemy, but as a human being standing on the edge of a cliff. The train rattled on, carrying them deeper into the night, deeper into the lawless dark. The three men stepped forward, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor, reaching out to touch the hem of Lila's dusty dress. The inciting moment was seconds away. The fuse was lit, and in the heavy, suffocating air of the third-class carriage, two strangers, a girl with a stolen book and a warrior with nothing left to lose, sat in the silence before the storm. The heavy thud of boot heels on the wooden floorboard synced with the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels, counting down the seconds to disaster. The three men moved with the slow, deliberate arrogance of predators who knew the flock had nowhere to run. They stopped at every row, yanking hats off sleeping men and tilting the chins of terrified women toward the flickering lantern light. Lila Monroe pressed herself against the cold glass of the window, her breath fogging the pain. Outside, the desert was a black void, swallowing the world whole. Inside, the air was suffocating. She could smell the stale whiskey drifting from the gunman, a scent that mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of fear sweating out of the passengers. Her fingers ached from gripping the canvas bag on her lap. The ledger inside felt hot against her skin, a burning evidence of sins that were not her own but for which she would pay the price. The leader of the trio, the man with the scar through his eyebrow, paused at the bench just 2 rows ahead. He grabbed a young man by the collar. A boy, really, no older than 20. The boy stammered, his eyes wide, but the gunman merely shoved him back against the seat with a sneer. "Not him." The gunman grunted to his companions. "Too ugly." The other two laughed, a low, grating sound that made Lila's stomach turn. They were enjoying this. It was not just a job. It was a sport. Lila pulled the brim of her bonnet lower, tucking her chin into the rough wool of her cloak. She closed her eyes, trying to summon a prayer, but all she could hear was the voice of Colonel Maddox, raspy and possessive, telling her that she would never leave him. "You are mine, Lila, like the cattle, like the land, mine." The boot stopped next to her bench. The silence that fell over the immediate area was heavy, broken only by the wheezing of the train engine. Lila did not look up. She stared at the scuffed leather of the gunman's boots, caked in red Arizona dust. "Well, now," a voice drawled from above her, dripping with mock politeness. "What do we have here, a little bird hiding in the dark?" Lila stopped breathing. She felt the heat of a body leaning over her. A hand, rough and smelling of gun oil, reached out and hooked a finger under the brim of her bonnet. She tried to pull away, but the hand was faster. It jerked her head up, forcing her into the harsh, yellow light of the lantern. The gunman stared at her. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. He studied her face, cataloging the pale skin, the high cheekbones, the trembling lip. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the wanted poster, and held it up next to her face. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips, revealing yellowed teeth. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, though in the silence of the car, it sounded like a shout. "Found you." He reached down and clamped his hand around her upper arm. His grip was like an iron shackle. "Mrs. Maddox, or should I say, the Colonel's missing property." "No!" Lila gasped, the word barely a breath. She tried to wrench her arm free, but his fingers dug into her flesh, bruising the skin through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Don't be shy, darling," the gunman laughed, pulling her upward. "We have a long ride back. The Colonel is going to be so happy to see you. He might even let us watch him teach you some manners." Panic, cold and absolute, flooded Lila's veins. The other passengers looked away, studying their boots or the darkness outside. No one would help her. To interfere with Colonel Maddox's men was to invite a shallow grave in the desert. She was alone. The gunman yanked her hard, forcing her to stumble into the aisle. The canvas bag slipped from her lap, but she caught it with her free hand, clutching it to her chest as if it contained her very soul. "Get the rope, boys," the leader called out to his companions, not taking his eyes off Lila. "She looks like a kicker." Lila's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She looked around wildly, her vision blurring with tears of terror. To her right was the aisle, blocked by the other two men. To her left was the seat she had just vacated, and opposite her, in the corner, sat the man in the fur coat. Cale had not moved. He sat with his legs stretched out, his arms crossed over his chest, seemingly asleep. But his eyes were open. They were dark, bottomless pools reflecting the lantern light, watching the scene with a terrifying detachment. He looked at the gunman's hand on her arm, then at her face. In that fraction of a second, time seemed to stretch. Lila saw something in those dark eyes. No pity, not heroism, but a recognition of the trap. He knew what it was to be hunted. He knew what it was to be looked at as a thing, not a person. She did not think. Instinct, ancient and desperate, took over. She lunged, not away from the gunman, but toward the corner. The sudden movement caught the man off guard, and his grip loosened just enough. Lila fell back onto the bench, scrambling across the wood until her shoulder bumped against the heavy, coarse fur of the stranger's coat. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, pleading, stripping her soul bare before this silent warrior. The gunman was reaching for her again, his shadow falling over them both. Lila leaned in, her face inches from the stranger's ear, and whispered the words that felt like madness even as they left her lips. "Sir, may I slip under your coat?" It was a request so absurd, so intimate, so terrifyingly bold for a preacher's daughter who had never even held a boy's hand before her forced marriage, that the air seemed to freeze in her lungs. Cale looked at her. For a heartbeat. He did not react. He saw the sheer terror in her. Yes, but he also saw the fire. A rabbit would have frozen and died. A wolf would have bitten. This girl was doing something else. She was surviving. She was asking him to cross a line he had drawn in the sand years ago, the line between the white man's problems and his own survival. The gunman's hand was inches from her hair. "Get back here, you little—" Cale moved. It was not a hesitant gesture. It was fluid and decisive. The movement of a man who did not second guess. He uncrossed his arms and, in one sweeping motion, grabbed Lila by the waist. He did not push her away. He pulled her in. He yanked her off the bench and into the space between his spread legs, turning her body so her back was pressed against his broad chest. In the same motion, he flared the heavy fur coat open like the wings of a great dark bird and snapped it shut around her. Darkness swallowed her. For a moment, Lila knew nothing but shock. The world of the train carriage, the gunman, the lantern, the dust vanished. She was encased in a cocoon of heat and shadow. The sensation stole her breath. It was intimate in a way that made her face burn in the darkness. She was pressed against the hard wall of his chest. She could feel the slow, steady thud of his heart against her shoulder blades. a stark contrast to the frantic rhythm of her own. The coat smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, old leather, and the distinct, musky scent of a man who lived under the open sky. It was a wild smell, dangerous and comforting all at once. She was trembling, her whole body vibrating with adrenaline, but his arm was a solid bar of iron across her midsection, holding her firmly in place. His legs bracketed hers, shielding her. She was effectively buried, hidden in plain sight within the embrace of a stranger. "What the hell?" The gunman's voice cracked with confusion. Lila felt Cale's shift slightly. The vibrations of his voice rumbled through his chest and into her back before she even heard the words. "Step back," Cale said. His voice was low, a deep timbre that seemed to scrape against the bottom of a gravel riverbed. Suddenly, the coat was ripped open. The light blinded Lila for a second. The gunman stood there, his mouth slightly agape, staring at the scene before him. He saw the girl pressed intimately against the warrior, the heavy fur draped over her shoulders, the man's arm wrapped protectively around her waist. It was a scandalous image, a white woman nestled in the arms of a native scout. It defied every social law of the territory. Lila's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. She gasped, the air rushing back into her lungs, her breath hitching. She looked up at the gunman, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. To the gunman, it looked like the flush of guilt, or perhaps something more carnal. "She is my wife," Cale said. The lie hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He spoke English with a deliberate, thick accent, chopping the rhythm of the words to sound less educated, less dangerous. "She has a fever, the sickness of the lungs. We will go to the doctor in Santa Fe." The gunman blinked. He looked from Lila's flushed, terrified face to Cale's stoic mask. He looked at the wanted poster in his hand, then back at the couple. The woman in the drawing was a lady, the wife of a colonel. This girl, cowering under a savage's coat, looking disheveled and clinging to a dirty Indian. It did not fit the image of the elegant Mrs. Maddox. "Your wife," the gunman spat, his face twisting in disgust. "You expect me to believe a white girl married a—" He used a slur that made Cale's jaw tighten, though his expression did not change. "The sickness takes the mind, too," Cale said calmly, his hand moving up to rest protectively on Lila's shoulder, pushing her face back down toward his chest as if to hide her delirium. "She wanders. She is afraid. Leave us." The gunman hesitated. The disgust was warring with the greed for the reward money. But the fear of disease was a potent thing in the West. "Fever?" he asked, taking a half-step back. "Black fever," Cale improvised, his dark eyes boring into the gunman's. "Very bad. Very exciting." The passengers nearby shifted uneasily, leaning away from the corner. The gunman scowled. He looked closely at Lila again. She seized the moment, letting out a harsh, racking cough, not entirely fake. As the dust and fear had dried her throat, she buried her face in Cale's shirt, trembling violently. "Hell," the gunman muttered, wiping his hand on his duster as if he had touched something unclean. "Filth." He turned to leave. Lila felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made her faint. Cale's arm relaxed slightly, but then the gunman stopped. He turned back, his eyes narrowing on the canvas bag that Lila was still clutching to her stomach, even inside the coat. "Wait a minute," the gunman said softly. He reached out and poked the bag with the barrel of his revolver. "That's a mighty fine bag for a squaw." He looked at Lila's boots. They were dusty. Yes, but they were made of fine kid leather, with intricate stitching. Not the boots of a poor woman married to a scout. The realization dawned on his face. The disgust vanished, replaced by a predatory triumph. "You lying son of a bitch," the gunman snarled. He reached for his holster. "That is her." Cale did not wait for him to draw. The explosion of movement was instantaneous. Cale shoved Lila hard to the side, sending her sprawling onto the bench. In the same breath, his right hand blurred. He didn't reach for his own gun, that would be too slow. Instead, he kicked upward, his heavy boot connecting solidly with the gunman's wrist. The bone snapped with a sickening crunch. The gunman howled, his Remington flying from his hand and skittering across the floor. Pandemonium erupted. The other two gunmen shouted and drew their weapons. Women screamed. Passengers dived for the floor. Cale was a whirlwind in the confined space. He lunged from his seat, tackling the leader before the man could recover. He drove his shoulder into the man's gut, slamming him backward into his companions. The three of them went down in a tangle of limbs and leather dusters. "Run!" Cale roared, his voice abandoning the fake accent, ringing out clear and commanding. Lila scrambled up, hugging the bag. The air filled with the deafening roar of a gunshot one of the men had fired blindly into the ceiling. Wood splinters rained down. Cale rose from the pile, holding the leader's knife which he had stripped from the man's belt. He slashed the air, backing the other two men off for a split second. His eyes met Lila's. "The door!" he shouted, pointing to the rear of the car. Lila didn't freeze this time. She turned and ran. The train was swaying violently, making the floor pitch and roll like a ship deck. She slammed into the rear door, fumbling with the heavy iron latch. Behind her, the sound of fists meeting flesh and the crashing of bodies echoed. She threw the door open. The wind roared in, a deafening blast of desert air. The noise of the wheels was thunderous here, unmuted by the carriage walls. The ground below was a blur of shadow rushing past at 30 miles an hour. She looked back. Cale was backing toward her, throwing a heavy crate of mining supplies into the aisle to block the gunman. He turned and sprinted toward her, grabbing her arm. "Jump!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. "What?" Lila screamed, staring at the rushing darkness. "We'll die." "They will kill you if you stay," Cale shouted. He didn't give her time to debate the physics of the fall. The gunmen were scrambling over the crate, raising their weapons. A bullet pinged off the metal railing next to Lila's head, singing a deadly high note. Cale wrapped his arm around her waist again, firm, unyielding. "Trust me." He didn't wait for an answer. He launched them both into the void. For a terrifying second, they were weightless, suspended in the black night between the train and the earth. The stars spun dizzily overhead. Then the ground rushed up to meet them. They hit the slope of a sand dune that ran alongside the tracks. Cale took the brunt of the impact, twisting his body in mid-air to land beneath her. They rolled, a chaotic tangle of limbs, fabric, and canvas bag. The world became a violent spin of sand and sky. They tumbled down the embankment, grit filling their mouths, the breath knocked out of them with every rotation. Finally, they came to a halt at the bottom of a dry wash. Lila lay on her back, staring up at the vast, indifferent universe. Her lungs burned, her side ached. She coughed, hacking up dust, her throat raw. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up to her elbows. She checked the bag. It was still there. The strap twisted around her wrist. A few yards away, Cale was rising. He dusted the sand from his fur coat with a sharp, angry motion. He checked his revolver. It was still in its holster. He checked his limbs. He was bruised, but whole. He stood tall, a dark silhouette against the starlight. He looked up at the train tracks on the embankment above. The train was already a distant string of lights, fading into the west. The sound of the whistle drifted back to them, a mournful, mocking cry. He turned to look at her. In the silence of the desert, the weight of what had just happened settled on them like a stone. He had attacked 3 white men. He had kidnapped a white woman at least. That was how the law would see it. He had abandoned his anonymity, his safety, and his plan to disappear. Lila scrambled to her feet, her dress torn, her bonnet gone, her hair wild and full of sand. She looked at the man who had just thrown her off a moving train. "You," she wheezed, trying to find her voice. "You saved me." Cale stared at her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He spat a mouthful of bloody saliva into the sand. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice flat and cold. He turned his back on her and began walking south, into the deep, trackless desert. "Keep up," he called back without looking. "Or the coyotes will have you before morning." Lila stood there for a second, clutching her bag. She looked at the empty tracks, then at the retreating back of the warrior. She took a deep breath, the cold night air filling her lungs, and realized that for the first time in her life, she was truly, completely free and terrified. She hurried after him, her boots crunching in the sand, following the long shadow of the man who had let her slip under his coat. The sun rose over the eastern mesas not as a bringer of light, but as a hammer striking an anvil. By mid-morning, the Arizona desert was no longer a landscape. It was a furnace designed to test the limits of human endurance. Cale moved through this hellscape with the fluid, silent grace of a mountain lion. He did not fight the terrain. He negotiated with it. He knew which rocks would hold his weight, which patches of scrub brush hid rattlesnakes, and how to breathe the thin, superheated air without drying out his throat. Lila Monroe did not have this knowledge. To her, the desert was an endless, blinding torture. Her boots, made for the wooden floors of a church or the parlor of a parsonage, were thin-soled and offered no protection against the sharp rocks and scorching sand. Her dress, the calico now ripped at the hem and stained with the red dust of the territory, felt heavy and suffocating. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the grit for the third time in an hour. She did not cry out. She simply gasped, the sound dry and brittle, and clutched the canvas bag to her chest as if it were a shield. Cale stopped. He did not turn immediately. He stood 10 paces ahead, a silhouette against the shimmering heat haze, the heavy fur coat draped over his arm now, his linen shirt damp with sweat but his posture unyielding. He turned slowly, his dark eyes assessing her. He looked at the flushed skin of her face, the cracked lips, the way her hands trembled as she pushed herself back up. A white woman should have collapsed 2 miles back. Most men he knew soldiers. Miners would have been complaining by now. She said nothing. She dusted off her knees, tightened her grip on the bag, and looked at him, waiting. "You walk loud," Cale said, his voice flat, "like a buffalo." "I'm sorry," Lila rasped, her voice a ghost of its former self. "I am not used to this." "The desert does not care what you are used to," Cale replied. He walked back to her, uncorking his canteen. He held it out. "Drink, 2 swallows, no more." Lila took the canteen with shaking hands. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever experienced. She forced herself to stop after 2 gulps, though her body screamed for more. She handed it back. Cale watched her. He watched the way she protected the bag, even when she fell. She landed on her elbows to keep the canvas from hitting the rocks. "What is in the bag?" he asked. Lila froze. "Personal things, a Bible." Cale's eyes narrowed. "You lie badly. A Bible does not weigh 5 pounds, and a woman does not risk her neck jumping from a train for a book of prayers." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Maddox's men, they called you property. They want you, but they looked at that bag with hunger. Tell me." Lila looked up at him. The heat was dizzying, but his gaze was sharper than the sun. She realized suddenly that she could not lie to this man. He had saved her life. He had thrown away his own safety for her. And out here, in the vast emptiness, secrets were just dead weight. She walked over to the shade of a large, overhanging sandstone slab, a small mercy in the ocean of heat. She sat down and began to untie the frantic knots she had made in the canvas straps. Cale followed, squatting on his heels a few feet away, resting his forearms on his knees. Lila pulled out a petticoat, then unwrapped it to reveal a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. The cover was embossed with gold letters, Maddox Cattle Rail Company, fiscal year 1874. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and neat, jagged handwriting. "My father," Lila began, her voice trembling slightly. "He is a good man, but he is weak. He believes that God will provide, but he gambles as if he wants to test God's patience. He owed Colonel Maddox $3,000. Cale made a low sound in his throat. $3,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a town. The colonel made an offer, Lila continued, looking down at the book. He would forgive the debt. If he could have me. She swallowed hard. He likes young things, things he can mold. He said I would be his wife. But the day after the wedding, I found this in his safe while he was passed out from whiskey. She turned the book toward Cale. She pointed to a page. Here, she said. Read the names. Cale looked. He could read English. He had been forced to learn it at the mission school before he ran away, and the names leapt off the page like strikes of lightning. Judge Halloway, $500, ruling on water rights. Sheriff Briggs, $50 a month. Blindness. Incident at Eagle Creek, $20. Hired guns for removal of squatters. Cale's breath hitched. Removal of squatters. That was the polite white term for murder. He saw the date. It was 2 years ago. He remembered that week. He remembered the smoke rising from the southern settlement of his people. He remembered finding his uncle's body face down in the mud. Lila turned another page. There is more. He plans to take the entire valley. He calls it the Expansion Project. He is paying the government surveyor to redraw the maps, to declare the reservation land as uninhabitable so he can claim it for grazing. Cale stared at the book. This was not just a ledger. It was a weapon. It was the proof that his people had suspected but could never find. It was the reason the soldiers turned a blind eye when Maddox's cattle trampled their corn. It was the reason men disappeared in the night. He looked at Lila. She was terrified. Yes, but beneath the fear, there was a steel spine. She had stolen the devil's diary. I could not stay, she whispered. I could not let him touch me. Knowing his hands were covered in blood, I thought, if I could get this to Santa Fe, to the federal marshal. The marshal is likely bought too, Cale said bitterly. He stood up and walked to the edge of the shade. Looking out at the shimmering horizon, he was torn. A violent storm raged inside him, hotter than the desert sun. His instinct, honed by years of betrayal, screamed at him to walk away. This girl was a lightning rod. She would bring the colonel, the sheriff, and every hired gun in the territory down on top of them. If he helped her, he put his own life at risk. If he took her to his people, he brought the wolf to the sheepfold. But the book was justice. It was the only thing that could stop the slow strangulation of his tribe. He looked back at her. She was watching him, her eyes large and luminous in her dusty face. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll dropped in a coal chute. But she had jumped off a train. She had walked through the fire. Pack it, Cale commanded abruptly. We move. If we stay here, the sun will cook us before Maddox catches us. Where are we going? Lila asked, scrambling to wrap the ledger. To water, Cale said, and then to a place where the white man's map is blank. The day dragged on, an endless cycle of putting one foot in front of the other. Cale led them higher, into the broken country where the flat desert gave way to jagged canyons and mesas of red rock. The terrain was harder, but the air was slightly cooler as the elevation climbed. By the time the sun began to dip below the western rim, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, the temperature plummeted. In the desert, there is no twilight. There is only the furnace and then the freezer. They found shelter in a shallow cave, really just a deep indentation in a limestone cliff face, shielded from the wind by a pile of fallen boulders. Cale built a small fire, tiny, really made of dried sage and twisted roots, hidden deep in the rocks so the light would not carry. Lila sat near the fire, but it was not enough. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. Her thin calico dress offered no more warmth than a spider web. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She tried to stop the shivering, afraid it would annoy Cale, but her body betrayed her. Cale sat on the other side of the small flame, chewing on a strip of dried venison. He had donned his heavy fur coat again. He looked comfortable, a part of the landscape, while she felt like an intruder about to expire. He watched her from under his heavy brows. He saw the blue tint of her lips, He saw the way she curled into a ball, trying to preserve what little heat she had left. He finished his meal in silence. He knew what he should do. Decency demanded it. But to share his space, his warmth, with a white woman, it felt like a betrayal of who he was. And yet, he could not let her freeze. She carried the book. She carried the truth. Lila looked up. Her eyes were glassy with cold. She hesitated, biting her lip, remembering the moment on the train, the memory of his heat, his scent, the overwhelming sense of safety he had provided in that terrifying second.
Sir,
she whispered, her voice trembling violently. Cale stopped chewing. He looked at her.
may I?
She had to stop to control the chattering of her teeth.
May I slip under your coat, just for the night?
The question hung in the thin, cold air. It was the same question, but the context had shifted. On the train, it was a desperate ploy for survival against men with guns. Here, it was a plea for survival against the elements, but it felt more dangerous now, more intimate. Cale stared at the fire for a long moment. Then, without a word, he moved. He shifted from his cross-legged position to sit against the rock wall. He unbuttoned the heavy wooden toggles of the coat and spread the left side open, creating a space. He nodded once. Lila did not hesitate. She scrambled across the small space between them on her hands and knees. She moved into the circle of his arm, pressing her back against his side, curling her legs up. Cale closed the heavy fur over her. The transformation was instant. It was like stepping from a winter storm into a warm cabin. The coat was lined with thick wool, and it held his body heat with an almost magical efficiency. Lila let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving her muscles. "Thank you," she breathed into the fabric of his shirt. Cale did not answer. He adjusted his position, ensuring the coat covered her completely, tucking the edges under her legs. His arm rested on the outside of the coat, across her waist, a heavy weight that felt grounding. They sat in silence. The fire crackled, dying down to embers. Lila became hyper-aware of him. She could feel the slow, powerful rhythm of his heart against her ear. She could smell him sage, smoke, leather, and something earthy and masculine that made her own heart beat a little faster. It was improper. It was scandalous. If her father could see her now, huddled against a savage in the dark, he would preach a sermon on damnation. But Lila did not feel damned. She felt safe. For the first time since her father had shook hands with Colonel Maddox, she felt safe. "You are very warm," she murmured, almost asleep. "You are very cold," Cale replied, his voice low and vibrating through his chest. "Like a lizard." Lila let out a small, sleepy laugh. "I suppose I am." She shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable. Her head rested naturally in the hollow of his shoulder. Cale stiffened for a second, then slowly relaxed. He did not pull away. Inside the coat, in the dark, his hand moved tentatively, carefully to rest against her back, offering an extra layer of warmth against the stone wall. He stared out into the darkness. He was holding the enemy. He was protecting the daughter of the people who had stolen his world, and yet listening to her breathing even out into sleep, feeling the small, fragile weight of her against him. He felt a strange tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The peace did not last. The morning did not bring the sun. It brought the wind. It started as a low moan in the canyons, then grew to a shriek. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow. Cale woke instantly, the instinct of a scout snapping him to attention. He shook Lila awake. "Up," he commanded. "Storm!" Lila blinked, disoriented. Before she could ask what was happening, the wind hit them. It wasn't just air, it was a solid wall of sand. The visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. The world became a screaming brown void. The sand stung like thousands of tiny needles, finding every exposed inch of skin. "The bag!" Cale shouted over the roar. "Keep it close." They couldn't stay in the shallow cave. The wind was funneling into it, creating a vortex that threatened to flay the skin from their bones. Cale grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her deeper into the rocks, looking for a crevice, a low spot. "Get down," he yelled, pulling her into a depression behind a fallen slab of granite. They huddled together, but the coat was flapping wildly now, threatening to tear away. Cale realized it wasn't enough. He pulled Lila down into the sand, forcing her flat. He lay over her, using his larger body as a shield against the onslaught. He pulled the coat up over both of their heads, creating a small, breathless pocket of air. "Keep your eyes closed," he ordered, his mouth close to her ear. "Breathe through the cloth." Lila buried her face in his chest, clutching the bag between them. The wind howled like a demon, piling sand on top of them. The weight grew heavy. She felt as if they were being buried alive. Panic flared in her chest, the claustrophobia of the grave. She struggled, gasping. I can't breathe." Cale's arms tightened around her, iron bands holding her together. "You can," he said, his voice calm and absolute in the chaos. "I am here. I have you. Breathe slowly." His calm was an anchor. Lila focused on it. She focused on the steady thud of his heart, the only constant thing in a world that was dissolving into dust. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. They lay there for what felt like hours, an entangled knot of humanity beneath the fury of the earth. Finally, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and strange. Cale moved first, shaking the sand off the heavy fur. He pushed himself up, the sand cascading off his back like water. He helped Lila sit up. They looked like ghosts, covered in fine gray powder from head to toe. Lila coughed, clearing her throat. She looked around. The landscape had changed. Landmarks were gone. Dunes had shifted. Cale stood up and walked to the edge of the wash, scanning the horizon. The air was clear now, the sky a piercing, innocent blue. He froze. He dropped to a crouch, his eyes fixed on the ground near the base of the canyon they had just traversed. The storm had scoured the ground clean in many places, but in the lee of the cliff, where the wind hadn't reached, there were marks. Fresh marks. Lila crawled over to him. "What is it?" Cale pointed. "Shod horses. 4 of them, moving fast." He looked back the way they had come. "The storm covered our tracks, but it covered theirs too. These prints, they were made just before the wind hit. They are close, maybe 2 hours behind." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Maddox? His men," Cale said grimly. "They have a tracker. A good one. He guessed we would head for the high ground." He looked at Lila. She was exhausted, battered, covered in dust, but she was looking at him with total trust. She was waiting for him to tell her how they would live. Cale looked to the north. There, hidden behind a labyrinth of slot canyons and treacherous peaks, lay the Eagle River Valley, his home, the last sanctuary. He had sworn an oath on his father's grave that no white man would ever set foot there with his help. To bring her there was to break the sacred law. It was to invite the possibility of discovery. But if he left her here or tried to make for a white town, she would be dead by sunset. And the book, the proof of the murders, the hope for his people would return to Maddox's safe. He looked at the ledger bag in her hands. Then he looked at her face. He remembered the feel of her sleeping against his chest, the trust in her voice when she asked to slip under his coat. He was a warrior. His duty was to protect the tribe. And suddenly, he realized that protecting this girl and protecting his tribe were no longer 2 different things. They had followed the same path. "We do not go to Santa Fe," Cale said, his voice hard with resolve. "Where then?" Lila asked. Cale pointed north, toward the jagged peaks that looked like the teeth of a sleeping god. "Home," he said. "I will take you to the Eagle River, to my people." Lila stared at him. She knew enough about the savages from the stories to know that they did not welcome outsiders. She knew what a risk he was taking. "Cale," she said, using his name for the first time. It felt strange on her tongue, solid and real. "Why?" Cale adjusted his coat, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He looked her in the eye, and for the first time, the barrier of indifference was gone. "Because you carry the truth," he said. "And because You did not complain about the cold. It was a joke, dry and small. But it was there. Lila smiled, her cracked lips stretching painfully. Let's go, Cale said, extending a hand to pull her up, as Lila took his hand, feeling the rough calluses against her palm. She felt a strange fluttering in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the heat. It was the realization that she would follow this man into hell if he asked, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. They turned north, walking side by side into the shadows of the canyon, leaving the tracks of their pursuers behind, walking toward a sanctuary that might save them or destroy them both. The transition from the purgatory of the desert to the sanctuary of the Eagle River Valley was so abrupt, it felt like stepping through a mirror. One moment, Lila Monroe was stumbling over scorched shale, her throat coated in dust. The next, she was standing on a ridge, looking down at a world painted in impossible greens. The valley was a hidden vein of life amidst the stone carcass of the territory. A river, clear and cold as melted snow, sliced through the center, fed by the high peaks that cradled the land like protective hands. Cottonwood trees, their leaves turning a brilliant gold in the autumn air, lined the banks. Smoke curled lazily from the tops of conical dwellings made of buffalo hide, and the air smelled not of sulfur and heat, but of pine resin, damp earth, and roasting meat. Lila stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "It exists," she whispered. I thought places like this were only in storybooks." Cale stood beside her. He had shed the heavy fur coat, draping it over his shoulder. His posture, usually coiled and defensive, had loosened. "It exists because men like Maddox do not know the way," he said quietly. Yet, he led her down the winding goat path. As they descended, the silence of the valley shifted. It wasn't the dead silence of the desert. It was a living hush. The sound of children playing, of women scraping hides, of horses nickering it all ceased the moment Cale and the white woman stepped onto the valley floor. They walked through the camp like ghosts. Dozens of pairs of eyes watched them. Dark, unblinking eyes. There was no welcome in them, only a heavy, suffocating suspicion. Lila walked close to Cale, clutching her canvas bag, feeling the weight of her race like a brand on her forehead. To them, she was not a girl. She was the face of the enemy. She was the surveyor who measured their land, the soldier who burned their winter stores, the disease that took their children. A woman emerged from the largest lodge in the center of the circle. She was young, perhaps a few years older than Lila, with Cale's sharp cheekbones and eyes that burned with a fierce, protective intelligence. She wore a tunic of soft deerskin, and a medicine pouch hung at her waist. This was Ayanna. She did not look at Cale. She looked straight at Lila, her gaze stripping away the layers of calico and pretense. "You bring a storm, brother," Ayanna said, her voice sharp and clear in the stillness. She spoke English, but the cadence was clipped, angry. "We have enough ghosts here. We do not need another. She is not a ghost." "Ayanna," Cale replied, his voice low but firm. "She is a guest. She falls under my protection." "Protection," Ayanna scoffed. Stepping closer, she was shorter than Lila but radiated a power that made Lila want to shrink. "Look at her. She is soft. She smells of the Iron Road. She brings the eyes of the blue coats with her." Ayanna pointed a finger at Lila's chest, dangerously close to the hidden ledger. "She will lead the wolf to our door." Lila's heart pounded. She wanted to apologize, to flee, to disappear, but Cale stepped between them. "The wolf is already hunting," Cale said. "She carries a knife that can skin him." The tension in the camp was brittle enough to snap. Ayanna stared at her brother for a long, agonizing minute. Then, she turned her glare on Lila. "If she stays," Ayanna said. "She works. We have no food for useless mouths." The days that followed were a brutal education. Lila was not given a guest lodge. She was given a corner of Ayanna's dwelling and a pile of furs. She was not allowed to rest. Lila learned that the paradise of the valley was built on the ashes of grief, as she worked alongside the women hauling water from the river until her hands blistered. Scraping the flesh from hides until her shoulders screamed, she saw the truth that Maddox's ledger had been reduced to cold numbers. She saw the scars. One afternoon, while gathering wood, she met an old man sitting by the river. He had one leg, the other ended in a stump wrapped in leather. He told her, in broken English and hand signs, about the accident 2 years ago when the cattlemen had dynamited the lower canyon to divert the water. He had lost his leg. His grandson had lost his life. Lila went back to the lodge that evening and opened the black book. She found the entry. October, 1873. Blasting supplies. $150. Labor for water diversion. $60. It was there. The boy's life was worth less than the cost of the dynamite. The guilt was a physical weight in her stomach. She had lived in the parsonage, eating bread bought with her father's tithes, money that likely came from men like Maddox. She was part of this machinery. That night, the camp council met around the fire. Cale sat with the elders. Ayanna was there as the healer. Lila was expected to stay in the shadows, but she could not. She stepped into the firelight. The conversation died. "I know you hate me," Lila said, her voice shaking but clear. "I know I look like the people who hurt you, but I am not them." She held up the ledger. "This book," she said, "it has names. It has the dates. It proves that Colonel Maddox did not buy this land legally. It proves he stole it. It proves he was murdered to get it." An elder spoke, his face a map of wrinkles. "Paper means nothing to the white man's law. They burn paper." "Not if we take it to the federal court in Santa Fe," Lila insisted. She looked at Cale. "We don't run anymore. Running just makes us prey. We have to be hunters. We take this to a judge who isn't on Maddox's payroll. We force the law to work." Cale looked at her. He saw the change. The terrified girl on the train was gone. In her place was a woman who was beginning to understand the power of anger. "There are no honest judges," Ayanna muttered. "There is Judge Halloway," Lila said. "His name is in the book as taking bribes." "Yes, but there is a note." She opened the page. "Halloway is getting nervous. Demands more money. Threatens to talk. If he is scared, we can use that. Or we find Judge Sterling in the Northern District. He is known to hate Maddox." It was a desperate plan. A foolish plan. But it was a plan. Cale stood up. "She is right. We cannot hide in this valley forever. Eventually, they will find the pass. If we do not strike the head of the snake will eat us whole." The council murmured. They did not trust her, but they trusted Cale, and they were tired of hiding. The decision to fight changed the dynamic between the two women. Ayanna did not become warm, but the hostility shifted into a grim pragmatism. If Lila was going to be part of the war party, she could not be a liability. "You hold a gun like it is a venomous snake," Ayanna criticized the next morning, slapping Lila's elbow to correct her aim. They were in a clearing behind the lodges. Lila held an old Colt revolver, heavy as a brick. Her arm trembled. "My father said guns were the devil's tools," Lila said, gritting her teeth. "Your father is not here to save you from the devil." Ayanna snapped. "The devil wears a colonel's uniform. Aim." Lila fired. The bullet kicked up dirt 10 feet to the left of the target, a painted gourd on a stump. "Terrible," Ayanna said flatly. "Again." Over the next 3 days, the distance between the bullet and the gourd shrank. Ayanna taught her not just to shoot, but to listen. How to walk without snapping twigs. How to read the disturbance in the brush that signaled a deer or a man had passed. During a break, sitting on a log sharing a strip of dried meat, Ayanna looked at Lila. "My brother," Ayanna said, not looking at her. "He looks at you, too much." Lila blushed, the heat rising to her hairline. "He saved my life, that is all. Cale has saved many lives," Ayanna said. "He does not look at them the way he looks at you. He thinks he is stone, but the stone cracks." She turned to Lila, her eyes searching. "Do not break him. He has nothing left to give." "I would never hurt him," Lila said softly. "You are white," Ayanna said. as if that explained everything. Your world hurts us just by existing. But that evening, when Lila tore her skirt on a briar patch, Ayanna silently handed her a needle and sinew thread and showed her how to stitch it so it would hold against the brush. It was a peace offering, a small one, but it was there. The riding lesson happened 2 days later. To reach Santa Fe, they would have to drive hard. Lila could sit a horse, but she rode like a lady side saddle, gentle trots. That would not suffice for escaping Maddox's posse. You must ride like a warrior, Cale told her. They were by the river. The horses were watering. Cale brought over a large paint stallion, devoid of a saddle, wearing only a hackamore rope bridle. No saddle, Lila asked, eyeing the beast's broad, muscular back. Saddles are heavy. Speed is life. Cale said, up. He laced his fingers together to give her a leg up. Lila swung her leg over astride, scandalous and freeing all at once, and settled onto the horse's warm back. Cale swung up behind her in one fluid motion. The world suddenly narrowed to the points of contact between them. His chest was pressed against her back. His legs framed hers. His arms came around her to hold the reins, effectively enclosing her in a cage of muscle and heat. Lean with the horse, Cale murmured, his voice vibrating against her ear. Do not fight him. You are part of him. He urged the stallion into a canter. At first, Lila was rigid, bouncing uncomfortably, but Cale's hands left the reins for a moment to grip her waist, his thumbs pressing into her sides. Breathe, he commanded. Relax your hips. Move with him. She did. She let go of the fear and found the rhythm. The horse surged forward, the wind whipping her hair back into Cale's face. It was exhilarating. The power of the animal beneath her, the strength of the man behind her, it was a heady, intoxicating cocktail. The stallion shied suddenly at a rabbit darting from the brush. The horse reared slightly. Lila gasped and fell back, slamming hard against Cale. His arms tightened instantly, locking across her stomach to keep her from sliding off. His chin grazed her shoulder. He brought the horse to a halt, the animal dancing sideways. Easy, Cale soothed the horse, but he didn't let go of Lila. For a moment, neither of them moved. The adrenaline of the near fall had spiked their heart rates. Lila turned her head. Cale's face was inches from hers. She could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. She could see the small scar on his upper lip. She could feel his breath, warm and quick, mingling with hers. The air between them charged with a sudden, violent electricity. It wasn't the gratitude of the rescued or the duty of the protector. It was raw. Lila's lips parted. The phrase from the train echoed in her mind, stole her breath. He was stealing it again. Right here in the sunlight. She leaned back imperceptibly. An invitation. She wanted him to close that tiny distance. She wanted to know if he tasted like the smoke and wild sage that clung to his skin. Cale's gaze dropped to her mouth. His grip on her waist tightened, his fingers digging in. He wanted her. The desire hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted to forget the war, the ledger, the impossible divide between their worlds. But then he looked at her eyes. They were trusting, innocent. She was 18 years old, a girl who had seen too much darkness but still believed in light. And he was a man with blood on his hands, a man with no future to offer her but a running battle. To kiss her would be to claim her, and if he claimed her, he would destroy her. Cale squeezed his eyes shut for a second, a mask of pain crossing his features. Then he exhaled sharply and pulled back. You. His voice was rough, like grinding stones. You balance well. That is enough for today. He swung off the horse, leaving her suddenly cold and bereft on the animal's back. He didn't look at her as he checked the stallion's hooves. We ride at dawn tomorrow, he said, his tone strictly professional, walling himself off. Lila sat there, her heart aching with a strange mix of rejection and understanding. She touched her lips, which still tingled from the proximity of his, and knew that he hadn't pulled away because he didn't want her. He had pulled away because he cared enough to protect her from himself. The fragile peace of the valley shattered that evening. A lone rider appeared at the canyon entrance. The sentries whistled a bird call that signaled a friend. Not a foe. It was old Ben Carver. The old man looked like a walking dust storm. His mule was laden with supplies, but his face was grim. He rode into the center of the camp, sliding off his mount with a groan of old bones. Cale met him. "Ben, you are far from the whiskey trail, and you are far from smart, boy." Ben wheezed, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. He looked at Lila, who had emerged from the lodge. He took off his battered hat. "Miss Monroe, you're looking less like a parson's daughter and more like a wildcat. What is the news?" Ben Cale asked, cutting to the chase. "Bad?" Ben said. "Maddox isn't just angry. He's rabid. He's put a bounty on the girl. $2,000, dead or alive, and another $1,000 for the book." A gasp went through the gathered crowd. $2,000 was enough to make a saint turn sinner. "There's more," Ben continued, accepting a cup of water from Ayanna. "He's gathering men, not just his usual hired guns. He's bringing in the cavalry. He told the fort commander that the Eagle River people kidnapped a white woman. He's going to use that as an excuse to burn this valley to the bedrock. He says if the girl isn't returned in 3 days, he rides." 3 days, Cale repeated. The timeline had collapsed. "He means to wipe us out," Ayanna said, her voice cold. "He does not care about the girl. He wants the land. The girl is just the match to light the fire. We have to leave," Lila said, stepping forward. "If I am not here, he has no excuse. He will burn it anyway," Cale said. "But if we get to Santa Fe, if we get the federal marshal, we can stop the army. The army will not follow a man under indictment for fraud and murder." "It's 100 miles to Santa Fe," old Ben warned. "And every 2-bit bounty hunter in the territory is looking for you." "Then we make them look the wrong way," Cale said. He looked at the map drawn in the dirt. "We leave tonight. We take the high pass." The camp dissolved into hurried activity, but in the chaos, a shadow moved. A young brave named Elon stood at the edge of the firelight. He was 17, angry and hungry. He had listened to Ben's words, $2,000, and burned the valley. Elon looked at his mother, who was coughing in their lodge. He looked at his younger brothers, who were thin from a winter of scarce game. He believed, with the twisted logic of the desperate, that Cale was wrong. The white girl was dead. If she was gone, the soldiers would not come. And with $2,000, he could buy blankets, he could buy food, he could save his family. Elon did not pack. He slipped away into the darkness, moving silently toward the horse corral. He did not take a horse. That would make noise. He ran. He ran toward the south, toward the ridge where he knew Maddox's scouts would be watching. He carried no weapon, only a piece of Lila's calico dress he had found near the washing rocks, proof that he knew where the prize was hidden. As Cale and Lila packed their saddlebags, checking guns and wrapping the ledger in oilskin, they did not know that the clock had already started ticking faster than they could imagine. The betrayal had already left the valley, running on swift, silent moccasins to sell them out. The town of San Miguel sat on the edge of the civilized world like a pustule on a smooth face. It was larger than Black Creek, boasting a brick courthouse, 3 saloons, and the veneer of law and order. But beneath the whitewashed facades, the rot of Colonel Maddox's money had eaten through the foundation. Lila, Cale, Ayanna, and old Ben rode into the main street as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the dust. They were exhausted. The horses were foaming at the mouth, and the riders were coated in a layer of grit that turned their skin the color of the earth. They were making for the federal marshal's office, a blocky stone building near the plaza. Lila clutched the saddle horn. The ledger pressed against her ribs beneath her bodice where she had hidden it miles back. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. They were so close, just a few hundred yards to justice. Then, the street was blocked. Sheriff Briggs stepped out from the livery stable, flanked by 6 men. These were not the rough hired guns of the train. These were deputies with tin stars pinned to their chests, giving their violence the weight of the law. Briggs looked older than Lila remembered. His face was lined with the stress of a man who had sold his soul cheap and was now paying high interest. He held a double-barreled shotgun loosely in the crook of his arm. "That is far enough," Briggs said. His voice was not angry, merely resigned. Cale pulled his stallion up short. His hand drifted toward his Colt, but 3 rifles were instantly leveled at his chest. "Sheriff," Old Ben spat, reining in his mule. "I did not know you were working the toll road now." "Go home." "Ben," Briggs said wearily. He looked at Cale, then at Lila. "The colonel wants his wife back, and he wants the Indian who took her." "He did not take me," Lila shouted, her voice cracking with dust and desperation. "I went with him. To save my life." "That is not the story the colonel tells," Briggs replied. He signaled to his deputies. "Take the girl. Put the savages in the holding cells. If they resist, shoot them. The colonel said he prefers them alive for hanging, but he is not particular." Cale's eyes burned with a cold, lethal fire. He looked at the rifles, then at Lila. If he drew, she would be caught in the crossfire. He could see the calculation in his eyes, the warrior weighing a good death against her survival. "Do not," Lila whispered, terrified he would choose death. "Please, Cale, do not." Slowly, agonizingly, Cale raised his hands. "Smart," a deputy sneered. Grabbing Cale's bridle, they were pulled from their horses. Ayanna was shoved roughly toward the jailhouse, her face a mask of stoic fury. Cale was dragged down. A rifle butt slammed into his kidneys, forcing him to his knees before they hauled him up and marched him away. He did not look back, but Lila felt his absence like a sudden drop in temperature. Sheriff Briggs walked over to Lila's horse. He reached up, not unkindly, to help her down. "I'm sorry, Miss Lila," he muttered. "But a man has to eat." "You are not a man," Lila said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disdain. "You are a dog waiting for scraps." Briggs flinched, but he took her arm. "Come on, the colonel is waiting at the mansion. He is planning a welcome home speech." The Maddox mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, a monument to arrogance built of imported stone and stained glass. Lila was ushered into the parlor, a room that smelled of beeswax and expensive cigars, the scent of her captivity. Colonel Jasper Maddox stood by the fireplace. He was a handsome man in the way a viper is handsome, sleek, well-groomed, and deadly. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than a ranch hand earned in 5 years. When Lila entered, he smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My dear," he said, opening his arms, "you look terrible. The savage life does not suit you." Lila stood her ground. She was dirty, her dress was torn, and her hair was a disaster. But she felt stronger than she ever had in this room before. She carried the desert in her bones now. "Where is he?" Lila asked. "The Indian." Maddox poured himself a brandy. "In a cell. For now. Tomorrow, we will have a trial. A very short one. Kidnapping a white woman is a capital offense." "He did not kidnap me," Lila said. "I ran because of this." She did not show him the ledger, but she patted her bodice. Maddox's eyes narrowed. The veneer of politeness cracked. He took a step forward, his face darkening. "You have the book," he stated. "I do." Lila lied about its location, implying it was hidden elsewhere. "And if anything happens to Cale or Ayanna or Ben, the federal marshal gets it. I have already sent a letter." It was a bluff. A desperate, terrifying bluff. Maddox studied her. He saw the change in her. The girl who used to tremble when he raised his voice was gone. This woman looked him in the eye. He laughed softly. "You have grown claws. I like that. It will make breaking you more interesting." He walked over to her, invading her space. He smelled of lavender water and cruelty. "Here is the deal. Lila," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You will walk out onto that balcony with me. We are going to the courthouse square in 1 hour. You will smile. You will tell the good people of San Miguel that you were taken against your will,
that the shock made you hysterical, but now you are safe. You will be a loving, grateful wife. And if I refuse, then I will have the scout skinned alive, Maddox said pleasantly. And I will make you watch, and then I will burn that valley of his until the ash chokes the river. Lila felt the blood drain from her face. She knew he would do it. He was a man who viewed cruelty as a necessary tool of business. She looked down. She had to choose. The ledger could destroy him, but not before he destroyed Cale. She took a deep breath. She thought of Ayanna teaching her to shoot. She thought of Cale's warm coat in the freezing night. She thought of the way he had looked at her by the river with respect, not possession. She looked up at Maddox and forced her features into a mask of submission. She lowered her eyes. "If I do this," she said softly, "will you let them go, all of them?" "I am a man of my word," Maddox lied. Lila reached out and took his hand. She raised it to her lips. Suppressing the urge to vomit, she kissed his knuckles. "Very well, husband," she said. "I will be your good wife." Maddox grinned, triumph gleaming in his eyes. He had won. He owned her again. He did not notice that her other hand was pressed tight against her side, guarding the book that was burning a hole against her ribs. She was not submitting. She was positioning herself. Meanwhile, at the jailhouse, the mood was grim. Cale sat on the dirt floor of the cell, his wrists bound with iron cuffs. Ayanna sat opposite him, singing a low death song in their native tongue. "Stop," Cale said harshly. "We are not dead yet. We are in a stone box," Ayanna said. "And they have rifles. Then we find a way out," Cale said. "Testing the bars. They were solid iron. Outside, the sun had set, and the town was lighting up with lanterns. A shadow fell across the high, barred window of their cell. "You look comfortable," a gravelly voice whispered. Cale jumped up. "Ben, keep your voice down," old Ben hissed from the alleyway. "Unless you want the deputy to wake up from his nap." "Get us out," Cale demanded. "I am working on it. Stand back from the wall." There was a scratching sound, then a thud. A heavy object dropped onto the floor of the cell through the high window. It was a set of keys and a rusted sawed-off shotgun. "I had to get the deputy drunk to get the keys," Ben whispered. "Cost me my last bottle of good rye. You owe me, boy." Cale grabbed the keys. His hands shook slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. He tossed the keys to Ayanna's cell next door. "Where is Lila?" Cale asked, gripping the shotgun. "Maddox took her to the courthouse," Ben said. "He is calling a town meeting. Gonna show off his prize filly." Cale felt a surge of rage so powerful it nearly blinded him. "He will not keep her. There are 20 men out there." "Cale," Ben warned. "This is not a fight. It is a suicide." Cale looked at his sister. Ayanna had unlocked her door. She picked up a heavy piece of firewood from the corner of the sheriff's office as she stepped out. "Then it is a good day to die," Ayanna said fiercely. Cale kicked the back door of the jailhouse open. "No, it is a good day to make Maddox pay." The town square was packed. Torches flickered in the night air, casting dancing shadows on the faces of miners, ranchers, and townsfolk. They had gathered to hear the colonel speak, drawn by the promise of free whiskey and the scandal of the runaway bride. On the second-floor balcony of the courthouse, Colonel Maddox stood like a king surveying his subjects. He raised his hands, and the crowd fell silent. Sheriff Briggs stood behind him, looking miserable. "Friends," Maddox boomed, his voice carrying over the square. "Neighbors, tonight is a night of celebration, as you know. My beloved wife, Lila, was taken from me by the savages of the Eagle River. It has been a harrowing ordeal." He turned and extended a hand toward the glass doors. "But tonight, she has returned. A little shaken, perhaps a little frail, but safe." Lila stepped out. She had refused to change her dress. She stood there in the torn, dusty calico, a stark contrast to Maddox's finery. The crowd murmured. She looked like a wraith, pale and intense. Maddox clamped a hand on her shoulder, a possessive grip that looked affectionate from the street but dug into her collarbone painfully. "Smile," he hissed in her ear. Lila looked out at the sea of faces.
She saw curiosity. She saw judgment. She saw the faces of men who owed Maddox money and men who feared him. And then, at the back of the crowd, near the livery stable shadows, she saw a movement. A man stepped into the light of a torch. He wore a linen shirt stained with dried blood and trousers the color of the desert. He held a shotgun in one hand. Hanging by his side, Cale. He did not shout. He just stood there, looking up at her, his eyes locked onto hers across the 100 feet of distance. And in that gaze, Lila found the breath she had been missing. He had come for her, against all odds, against an army. He had come. Maddox followed her gaze. He saw Cale. "Sheriff," Maddox shouted, pointing down. "Shoot him! Shoot the dog!" The crowd screamed and parted. Clearing a circle around Cale, deputies raised their rifles. Time seemed to stop for Lila. This was the moment. If she stayed silent, Cale died. If she spoke, they might both die. But they would die standing. Lila reached into her bodice. She did not pull out a handkerchief. She pulled out the black ledger. She ripped her shoulder away from Maddox's grip. She stepped to the railing of the balcony, holding the book high above her head. "He is lying!" Lila screamed. Her voice was not the voice of a girl. It was the voice of judgment. "I was not kidnapped. I ran away. I ran away because Jasper Maddox is a murderer!" The crowd gasped. Maddox lunged for her, but she scrambled sideways, keeping the railing between them. "Read it!" Lila shouted, opening the book to the marked pages. "Incident at Eagle Creek, $20 for hired guns, murder of the Holloway family, $500 for the fire." "Shut her up." Maddox roared, his face turning purple. "Briggs' killer!" "Sheriff Briggs!" Lila yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the sheriff who stood frozen on the balcony. $50 a month for blindness. It is all here. Every bribe, every death." The crowd turned. They looked at Briggs. They looked at Maddox. The truth, spoken so plainly, with the physical evidence waving in the air, hit them like a physical blow. Maddox realized he was losing. The mob was turning. He was no longer the colonel. He was the villain. He snarled like a cornered animal. He drew the pearl-handled revolver from his hip. "Give me the book, you bitch!" Maddox screamed, raising the gun. "No!" Cale's voice roared from the street. Cale raised the shotgun, but the distance was too great for the weapon. He dropped it and drew the knife from his belt, sprinting toward the courthouse doors. Maddox fired. The sound was deafening. Lila flinched, expecting the bite of lead, but she was not hit. Down in the street, Cale stumbled. The bullet meant for Lila had caught him in the left shoulder as he ran into the line of fire, spinning him around. He hit the dirt, blood spraying. "Cale!" Lila screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Maddox cocked the hammer again, aiming directly at Lila's chest. "Die then!" Suddenly, a shot rang out from the side, but it did not come from the street. It came from the balcony. Maddox yelled and dropped his gun. His right hand was a ruin of blood and shattered bone. He staggered back, clutching his wrist, staring in disbelief at the man standing 5 feet away. Sheriff Briggs stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of his service revolver. His hand was steady. His eyes were sad, but clear for the first time in years. "That is enough, Jasper," Briggs said quietly. "It is over." "You—" Maddox gasped, sinking to his knees. "I bought you." "The lease expired," Briggs said. Below, the street erupted into chaos. Maddox's hired guns, seeing their boss fall, tried to fight. Ayanna, who had flanked the crowd, raised a rifle she had taken from the jail and fired, dropping a man who was aiming at her fallen brother. Old Ben appeared from the shadows with his own shotgun, firing into the air. "Drop 'em unless you want holes the size of melons." The townsfolk, fueled by Lila's revelation and the sheriff's turn, surged forward. They tackled the deputies. They disarmed the hired guns. The illusion of Maddox's power shattered like glass. On the balcony, Lila did not wait to see Maddox arrested. She did not wait to thank Briggs. She turned and ran. She ran through the courthouse halls, her boots skidding on the polished floors.
She flew down the stairs and burst out the front doors. The crowd parted for her. Cale was on his knees in the dust. He was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers, staining his shirt a dark, terrifying crimson. Ayanna was already at his side, pressing a cloth to the wound. Lila threw herself into the dust beside him. She didn't care about the dress. She didn't care about the crowd. "Cale," she choked out, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him, afraid not to. Cale looked up. His face was gray with shock, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Lila alive, safe, standing in the light. "You," he rasped, his voice weak. "You read the book." "I told you," Lila sobbed, tears finally spilling over, washing streaks through the dust on her face. "I told you I would make them pay. You speak loud," Cale whispered, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "For a lizard." Lila let out a laugh that was half a sob. She reached out and cupped his face, her thumbs stroking his cheekbones. The fear that had gripped her when the gun went off, the absolute, hollow terror of a world without him, crashed into her. She realized then, with the clarity of the gunshot that had just rung out, that this was not just gratitude. It was not just a partnership. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I cannot lose you." Cale leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut as the pain washed over him. "I am hard to kill," he murmured. "I have a good coat." Lila pulled him forward, resting her forehead against his, heedless of the blood, heedless of the scandal. In the middle of the street, surrounded by the ruins of Maddox's empire, she held the warrior who had caught her when she fell, and for the second time that night, her breath was stolen this time by the overwhelming, terrifying force of love. The back room of old Ben Carver's trading post smelled of stale tobacco, arnica, and blood. It was a small, cluttered space, usually reserved for storing sacks of flour and crates of ammunition, but now it served as a makeshift infirmary. Cale lay on a cot pushed against the far wall. His skin, usually the color of burnished copper, was ashen, gleaming with a sheen of cold sweat. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his left shoulder, shattering the clavicle but missing the artery by a fraction of an inch. It was a lucky shot. Or perhaps the spirits of the Eagle River had guided the lead just enough to spare him. Ayanna stood over him, her hands moving with the swift, practiced efficiency of a healer who had seen too many battle wounds. She was sewing the flesh back together with a bone needle and sinew, her face a mask of grim concentration. Lila Monroe knelt beside the cot. Her calico dress was stiff with dried mud and the dark stains of Cale's blood. Her hands, usually soft and unmarred, were trembling as she held the basin of warm water for Ayanna. But her eyes were dry. She had cried her tears in the street. Now, there was only room for resolve. "Hold him down," Ayanna commanded softly. "The fever is starting. He will fight the pain." Lila placed her hands on Cale's good shoulder and his chest. His skin was burning. As Ayanna tightened a stitch, Cale groaned, his body arching off the mattress, his eyes flying open but seeing nothing. He thrashed, murmuring words in his native tongue, commands to invisible warriors, warnings of fire. "Shh," Lila whispered, leaning close to his ear. "You are safe, Cale. You are safe." She smoothed the damp hair back from his forehead. Slowly, the tension left his frame, anchored by the sound of her voice. He slumped back, his breathing ragged. For 3 days and 3 nights, Death sat in the corner of the room, waiting to see if Cale's will was stronger than the infection. Outside the thick adobe walls, the town of San Miguel was undergoing a transformation. The fall of Colonel Maddox had sent shock waves through the territory. The federal marshal had arrived from Santa Fe, not bought by gold this time, but summoned by the sheer volume of evidence Lila had screamed from the balcony. The courthouse, once Maddox's personal throne room, became a place of reckoning. The black ledger sat on the judge's bench like a heavy stone tablet. Witnesses who had been silent for years terrified ranchers, widows of murdered men, and even members of the Eagle River tribe came forward. They spoke in hushed tones at first,
then with growing confidence as they realized the colonel was truly in chains. Sheriff Briggs was the linchpin. He sat on the witness stand, his arm in a sling from a scuffle during the arrest. He looked 10 years older, stripping away the veneer of authority to reveal the tired, broken man beneath. "I took the money," Briggs told the court, his voice devoid of emotion. $50 a month, to look the other way when the fires started, to say it was Apaches when it was white men in masks.
"I sold my badge."
"And why do you speak now?" the prosecutor asked. Briggs looked out the window, toward the trading post where Cale lay. "Because a girl had more courage than I did, and because I would like to sleep without seeing the faces of the dead." Briggs knew that by testifying. He was ending his career. More than that, he was painting a target on his back. Maddox had friends in high places, shadowy partners in the railroad companies who would not look kindly on a loose end. But Briggs walked out of the courthouse each day with his head up, a man who had finally bought back his soul, even if the price was his life. Inside the trading post, the battle was quieter but no less intense. Lila barely slept. She sat in a wooden chair by Cale's bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest. In the quiet hours of the night, when Ayanna had succumbed to exhaustion on a pile of blankets in the corner, Lila found herself staring at the wall, paralyzed by a new kind of fear. The crisis was over. Maddox was finished. The marriage that had bound her to the colonel was, for all intents and purposes, dissolved by his crimes. She was free, but freedom felt like a vast, empty plain. She looked at Cale. He was a warrior, a scout, a man of the earth and sky, and she was, what? A person's daughter, a white woman. In the eyes of the law, she was a victim. In the eyes of society, she was tainted. But in her own heart, she was simply a woman who had found the other half of her soul in the middle of a desert storm. Yet, the world outside these walls was cruel. They would call her a squaw man's woman. They would shun her, and worse, they would shun him for being with her. Would she be an anchor dragging him down? Would she force him to live in a world that despised him? Or would she have to live in his world, forever an outsider? One night, the fever broke. Cale stirred. His eyes opened, clear and dark, reflecting the low light of the oil lamp. He looked at the ceiling, then turned his head slowly to find Lila. She was dozing in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand loosely holding his. "Lila," he rasped. The name sounded rough, unused to the air. Lila jerked awake. "Cale, you're awake. Here, drink." She lifted a cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily, then fell back against the pillow. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was thin. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked nothing like the polished, fearful girl on the train. She looked worn. "You stayed," Cale said. It was not a question. "Where else would I go?" Lila asked softly. Cale looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at the ceiling. "You are free now. Maddox is in a cage. You can go back to the east, to your people." Lila stiffened. "My father sold me. I have no people there." "Then stay here," Cale said. "In the town. Ben says you can teach. You can live in a house with glass windows. You can be safe." Lila felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "And you?" "I go back to the river," Cale said. He turned his face away from her. "I am a scout. I live in the saddle. It is not a life for you." Lila pulled her hand away from his as if burned. "Is that what you think? Do I want glass windows? Do I want to be safe?" "I think you deserve them," Cale said to the wall. "I think you should not have to jump from trains or hide in the dirt. I think I am a man who brings bullets and blood. You should be far away from that." It was a noble speech. It was the speech of a man who loved her enough to let her go. And it broke Lila's heart. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I see. You saved me. So now you get to decide my future, just like Maddox, just like my father." Cale turned back, his eyes wide with shock. "No. I give you a choice.
You are pushing me away. Lila whispered fiercely. Because you are afraid. You are not afraid of guns. Cale. But you are terrified of this. She gestured between them. Before Cale could respond, Ayanna spoke from the corner. She had been awake the whole time. She is right, brother, Ayanna said, sitting up and wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. You are a fool. Cale scowled. This is not your business. It is my business when you try to throw away the best thing the spirits have sent you. Ayanna stood and walked over to the cot. She looked down at him with the brutal honesty of a sibling. All your life, you fight. You fight the soldiers. You fight hunger. You fight for a quiet place for us to live. And now the quiet place is standing right here, holding your hand for 3 nights while you scream at ghosts, and you tell her to go away. She is white, Cale muttered. The world will not let us be. The world, Ayanna laughed, a short, harsh sound. Since when do you care what the world thinks? Did you care when you threw her off the train? Did you care when you walked into a town full of rifles to get her back? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do not use her skin as an excuse for your cowardice. If you want her, fight for her. If you do not, then tell her you do not love her. Look her in the eye and say it. The room fell silent. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Cale looked at Lila. He saw the tears standing in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from anger. He saw the fierce set of her jaw. He tried to form the words, I do not love you, but they died in his throat. They were ash. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. I cannot say it. Lila sat back down. She took his hand again, squeezing it hard. Good, because I would not believe you. 2 weeks later, the gavel fell. The trial of Colonel Jasper Maddox was the fastest in the history of the territory. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Yuma, a hellhole from which few men returned. More importantly, the court ruled on the land. The deeds obtained through fraud and violence were declared void. The Eagle River Valley was returned to the tribe. With a federal decree of protection, the farms stolen from the settlers were restored. It was a victory, imperfect, perhaps, as the West was still wild and greed would always return, but it was a victory. On the day the news came, old Ben threw a party in the trading post. He opened a keg of beer and roasted a goat. The mood was light, hopeful. Lila stood by the window of the back room. Cale was up now, walking with a cane, his arm still in a sling. He was outside, talking to the elders who had come down from the valley to hear the verdict. Old Ben walked up beside her. He smelled of tobacco and satisfaction. Well, Miss Lila, Ben said. Looks like the good guys won one for a change. Yes, Lila said, her eyes fixed on Cale's figure in the dusty street. I meant what I said, Ben continued, leaning against the window frame. I need someone to help with the books. I'm getting too old to squint at numbers, and the town needs a school teacher. The mayor asked about you, said a woman who can stand down a colonel is the kind of woman who can handle a classroom of frontier brats. It was a generous offer, a sensible life, a salary, respectability. It is a good offer, Ben, Lila said. But, Lila turned to him. She smiled, and it was a smile that reached her eyes sad, wise, and beautiful. But my home is not in a classroom. She looked back out the window. Cale had finished speaking. He was standing alone, looking toward the mountains, looking toward the north. He looked lonely. Lila excused herself. She walked to the corner of the room where Cale's things were kept. Hanging on a peg was a heavy fur coat. The coat that had shielded her on the train. The coat that had kept her warm in the desert cave. It was clean now, brushed free of sand and blood. She took it down. It was heavy, smelling of him. She walked out the back door and into the sunlight. Cale heard her approach. He turned. He looked better, stronger, though the scar on his shoulder would mark him forever. He saw the coat in her arms. You are cold, he asked. No, Lila said. She walked up to him. They were standing by the river that ran behind the town, the water bubbling over smooth stones. Ben offered me a job, Lila said. Cale tightened his jaw. That is good. You will be a good teacher. I turned him down, Lila said. Cale stared at her. Why? Lila stepped closer. She held the coat up. Because I had a dream. When you were sick. A dream. I dreamed of a house, she said. Not a big house, a cabin, wood and stone. It was by a river, but not this one. It was up north, in the valley. Cale went very still. I dreamed there was a garden, Lila continued, her voice steady. Corn and beans, and books, lots of books. And I dreamed that in the evenings. A man would come home from the high ridges, a man who smelled of sage and smoke. She stopped, standing right in front of him. She looked up into his dark eyes. But in the dream, he was always alone. He would stand outside the door, afraid to come in, afraid he would dirty the floor, afraid he did not belong in the warmth. Cale looked down at her. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Lila unfolded the coat. She shook it out. I am tired of dreams. Cale, she whispered. I want the real thing, but I cannot have it if you stay outside. She raised the coat, standing on her tiptoes to drape it over his good shoulder. But she didn't stop there. She stepped in, pulling the other side around herself, just as he had done on the train, just as he had done in the cave. She buried her face in his chest. She wrapped her arms around his waist, avoiding his injured shoulder but holding him tight. Sir, she whispered, the words muffled against his shirt, echoing the first time she had ever spoken to him. May I slip under your coat and never leave? Cale stood there, frozen for a heartbeat. The barriers he had built, the pride, the fear, the certainty that he was destined to be alone crumbled. They turned to dust and blew away in the wind. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He dropped his cane. His good arm came around her, crushing her to him, burying his face in her hair. Lila, he breathed. You foolish, stubborn girl. Say it, she whispered against his heart. I love you, Cale said, the words rushing out like water from a broken dam. I love you more than the air, more than the land. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her. He brought his hand up to cup her chin. I have no glass windows, he warned, a teasing glint returning to his eyes. I prefer the stars, Lila replied. I have no money. I have a very expensive ledger, she countered. Cale smiled. It was a true smile, wide and unburdened. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss, nor a stolen one. It was a claim. It was a promise. It was the sealing of a treaty between two souls who had declared war on the world and won. Under the shelter of the heavy fur coat, standing by the river in the golden light of the afternoon, Lila Munro finally found the place where she belonged. She wasn't property. She wasn't a victim. She was home, old Ben, watching from the window, wiped a tear from his eye with a greasy rag. Damn fool kids, he muttered happily, and turned back to his inventory, knowing that the best story in the West had just found its beginning, not its end. The winter of 1876 came to the high country not with a roar, but with a slow, deepening silence that buried the scars of the land under 3 feet of pristine white snow. It was a hard winter, the kind that tested the marrow of bones and the strength of roof beams. But for the people of the Eagle River Valley, it was the first winter in a generation where the cold was the only enemy they had to fight. When spring finally broke, it arrived with a violence of color. The snowmelt roared down the peaks, swelling the river until it sang a thunderous song against the rocks. The valley floor, once trampled by the hooves of stolen cattle and marked by the charred circles of old fires, exploded in a carpet of bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and globe mallow. The land was healing. The heavy wooden fence lines that Colonel Maddox had erected to choke off the water rights had been torn down, their lumber repurposed. In the lower pastures, where the grass was sweetest, the tribe's horses grazed alongside a small herd of dairy cows belonging to the settlers who had returned to their stolen plots. It was a patchwork quilt of agriculture, rows of corn and squash growing in the traditional mounds of the Eagle River people, bordering straight furrows of wheat planted by Swedish immigrants who had come west looking for a home.
And standing at the intersection of these two worlds, on a gentle rise that overlooked both the winding road to San Miguel and the smoke-tipped lodges of the village, stood a house. It was not a mansion like the one Maddox had built to loom over the town. It was a cabin, sturdy and low-slung, built from hand-hewn cedar logs that smelled of resin and hard work. It had a wide porch that faced the sunset, a stone chimney that puffed white smoke into the blue sky, and, just as Cale had promised, it had glass windows. Lila Monroe, though most in the valley now called her Lila of the River, stood on that porch, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had changed. The girl who had boarded the train in a thin calico dress, trembling at her own shadow, was gone. In her place stood a woman of 19 who moved with the grounded confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, practical and warm, hemmed high enough to allow for riding. Her boots were scuffed leather, and at her hip, she wore a knife in a beaded sheath that Ayanna had made for her. She wasn't just the mistress of the house. She was its heart. Inside the main room, which served as both a parlor and a trading post, the shelves were stocked. There were jars of honey from the village, sacks of coffee from the town, blankets woven with the patterns of the Eagle River, and tools forged in St. Louis. It was a place of exchange, and not just of goods. Lila watched as a wagon rumbled up the new road. It was a sodbuster family from the lower valley, coming to trade eggs for lamp oil. "Good morning, Mrs. Cale," the farmer called out, tipping his hat. Lila smiled. She did not correct him. In the eyes of the church, they had stood before a circuit preacher 2 months ago, but in the eyes of the valley, they had been bound since the night of the storm. "The coffee is fresh today, Mr. Henderson," Lila called back. "And tell your wife I have the willow bark she asked for. It will help the baby's teeth." She spoke with an easy authority. She had learned the language of the tribe, twisting her tongue around the guttural, musical sounds until she could barter, joke, and sing in it. But she had also taught the village children English, sitting them in a circle under the great cottonwood tree, using the ledger, the very book that had brought down an empire, as a slate to teach them their letters. The ledger no longer held the secrets of murder. Lila had pasted paper over the columns of bribes and blood money. Now, the pages were filled with drawings of animals, the alphabet, and recipes for cornbread. She had turned a weapon into a primer. A sound from the corral drew her attention. Ayanna was there, breaking a young colt. Cale's sister had not softened. Exactly, she still had a gaze that could strip the bark off a pine tree, but the edge of bitterness was gone. She wore a mixture of traditional buckskins and a checkered shirt she had acquired from old Ben. Ayanna saw Lila watching and raised a hand in greeting. Lila returned the wave. They had forged a bond in the fire of the trial and the quiet intimacy of the winter months. Ayanna had taught Lila how to listen to the wind, how to find water in the rocks, and how to bring life into the world. Just last week, they had worked side by side for 12 hours to deliver a baby for a woman in the village, their hands moving in unison, one white, one copper, covered in the same blood of life. Lila turned her gaze toward the ridgeline. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in strokes of violet and burnt orange. He was late. Cale had gone into San Miguel at dawn. He went twice a week now, not as a scout for the army, but as a representative of the Valley Council. He negotiated cattle prices, filed land claims, and ensured that the new treaties were worth more than the paper they were written on. Lila felt a familiar tug in her chest. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was simply the ache of missing him, even after months of waking up beside him, of watching the morning light trace the sharp angles of his face. She still found herself counting the hours until he returned. Then she saw him. He rode the paint stallion, the same horse that had carried them to freedom. He moved down the switchback trail with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than on his feet. He was not wearing his buckskins today. He wore a clean linen shirt and canvas trousers, looking every inch the prosperous rancher, though his hair still hung long and loose, defying the fashion of the town. Lila walked out to the hitching post as he rode up. Cale swung down from the horse. He landed lightly, though he favored his left shoulder slightly, a permanent reminder of the bullet that had nearly taken him. He tied the reins and turned to her. His face was dusty, tired, etched with the lines of a long day spent arguing with stubborn merchants. But when his eyes met hers, the weariness evaporated.
"You are staring,"
Cale said, his voice a low rumble that Lila felt in her toes.
"I am inspecting the merchandise,"
Lila teased, reaching up to brush a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Did the mayor give you trouble about the water rights?" "The mayor talks like a crow," Cale said, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Loud and full of nothing. But he signed the paper. The upper creek belongs to the village. Forever." Lila let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "It is done, then." "It is done," Cale confirmed. He reached into his saddlebag. "I brought you something." He pulled out a small, brown paper parcel. Lila opened it to find a ribbon of blue silk, the exact color of the desert sky at noon. "For your hair," Cale said, looking suddenly shy, the fierce warrior replaced by the man who was still learning the soft language of courtship. "It matched your eyes." Lila smiled, blinking back sudden tears.
"It is beautiful. Thank you."
"And I brought something else," Cale said. He reached behind the saddle and untied a large, bulky roll of dark fur. It was the coat, the heavy, wolfskin coat that had started it all. It had been hanging in the back of the barn for the summer, gathering dust. Lila hadn't seen it in months. "Why did you bring this?" she asked. "It is not that cold." "The wind is changing," Cale said, looking up at the peaks. "Autumn is coming early, and I thought it needed airing." He threw the heavy coat over his shoulder, the familiar scent of pine and leather wafting over them. "Come," he said, "walk with me." They left the horses and the house, walking hand in hand toward the edge of the bluff that overlooked the entire valley. The air was indeed cooling, the sun slipping behind the mountains, casting the world in a twilight shadow that felt heavy with memory. Below them, the valley was settling in for the evening. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the new cabins and the smoke holes of the lodges. The sound of children's laughter drifted up on the breeze. Lila looked down and saw a group of boys playing near the riverbank. They were a mix, some from the tribe, with dark hair and swift feet, and others the sons of the settlers, fair-haired and clumsy. They were throwing stones into the water, competing to see whose splash was biggest. There was no animosity between them, only the universal language of childhood. Further up the bank, she saw old Ben Carver sitting on a stump outside a small shack he had built for himself near the village. He was smoking his pipe, gesturing wildly as he told a story to a captivated audience of young warriors. And there, carrying a sack of grain toward the storehouse, was Sheriff Briggs. He wore no badge now. He was just a man in suspenders, working off a debt that could never truly be paid, but finding peace in the attempt. He stopped to wipe his brow, and Ayanna walked past him. She didn't smile, but she nodded to him, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes. "Look at them," Lila whispered. "A year ago, they would have been shooting at each other." "People change," Cale said quietly. "When the fear is taken away." He looked at her. The twilight caught the gold in his eyes. "We changed," he added. Lila turned to face him. The wind picked up, whistling through the canyon, carrying a bite of the coming frost. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Cale watched her. He shifted the heavy coat from his shoulder, holding it open with both hands. The gesture was identical to the one on the train, yet entirely different. Then, it had been a hiding place. Now, it was a sanctuary. Lila looked at the open coat, then up at his face, the memory of the dusty train car, the smell of fear, the pounding of her heart. It all rushed back, but it was softened by time and love. A mischievous light danced in her eyes. She stepped closer, tilting her head. "Sir," she whispered, her voice dropping to that hushed, intimate tone she had used when she was a desperate stranger. "May I slip under your coat?" Again, Cale's stoic mask cracked. A smile broke across his face, rare, radiant, and entirely hers. "Always," he replied. He didn't just let her in, he pulled her. He wrapped the heavy fur around her, engulfing her small frame, and then wrapped his arms around the coat. She was pressed against his chest, the wool scratching her cheek, the heat of his body soaking into hers. Lila let out a long sigh, the tension of the day, the month, the year draining away. She inhaled the scent of him smoke, sage, and the clean sweat of honest work. It was the smell of home. "You stole my breath," she murmured against his shirt. "That first day, you stole it, and I've kept it," Cale whispered into her hair. "I will keep it safe." They stood there in silence as the sun finally vanished, plunging the valley into the soft blue of early night. Stars began to prick the sky, one by one, over the jagged silhouette of the mountains. From their vantage point, wrapped together in a single skin, they looked like one being, a fusion of two worlds that were never supposed to meet. Lila looked out at the darkness. She thought of her father, preaching fire and brimstone in a cold church. She thought of Maddox, rotting in a cell in Yuma. They were the past. They were the ghosts of a dead philosophy. Then she felt the strong, steady beat of Cale's heart against her ear. She felt the life growing in the valley below. "We are not running anymore, are we?" she asked softly. Cale tightened his embrace, resting his chin on the top of her head. He looked out at the land that had been returned to his people, at the road that brought new friends, and at the woman who had taught him that a warrior's greatest strength was not his ability to kill, but his ability to love. "No," Cale said, his voice firm and final. "We are not running. We are standing." The wind blew harder, tugging at the hem of the coat, but inside the shelter of the wolf skin, everything was still. Everything was warm. The story of the West was often written in blood and gunpowder, told by men who conquered and took. But here, on a ridge overlooking the Eagle River, a different story had been written. It was a story of a girl who found her courage in a stolen ledger, and a warrior who found his future in a stolen glance. It was a story that would be told around the fires of the Eagle River people for generations to come. They would tell of the White Wolf and the Scout. They would tell of the winter of the ledger, and they would tell their children that true freedom was not about wide-open spaces, but about finding the one person with whom you no longer had to hide. As the first true star of the evening flared to life, the North Star. The guide for all travelers, Cale and Lila turned to go back inside. They walked to the door of their cabin, the coat draped over both their shoulders, stepping out of the wild and into the home they had built with their own hands. They did not whisper for permission. They did not look over their shoulders. They walked with their heads high, the masters of their own fate, ready to face whatever the morning sun might bring to the free and wild West. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Lila and Cale as much as I enjoyed telling it. It has been a long ride from that dusty train car in Arizona to the peaceful cabin by the river. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know where you are listening from today. Are you in a busy city, a quiet countryside, or maybe traveling on a train yourself? Share your thoughts on the ending and what you think the future holds for Cale and Lila's children. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners around the world. Your support means everything and helps keep the spirit of the West alive. Safe travels, and see you on the next trail.